In prior modules, we've seen that many anti-poverty policies either require work or are related in some way to the amount of work done by the individuals they serve. In the next modules, we'll explore the relationship between poverty and employment and labor markets in the U.S. In this module, we'll provide an overview of the connection between poverty and employment. The first thing to note is that there are several different questions that can be asked about how poverty is related to employment, and each question can give a different impression of the underlying relationship. It's important to understand the details of these different ways of looking at the relationship between poverty and employment. Let's start by thinking about two different questions. First, we could ask how many of the poor work, or how much do the poor work? If this is the question, we probably need to refine it a bit. If we're asking about work, should we include in the sample of the poor children, who make up roughly 1/3 of the poor in the U.S.? What about the disabled who cannot work, or students who are choosing not to work while they pursue their studies? Another set of questions is whether to distinguish between non-work that is voluntary versus involuntary, those who want to work but cannot find a job. Second, we may want to flip this question on its head and start from the universe of all workers and ask how many workers are poor. With this question, we'll see it is also critical to think about how we define worker. Let's start with the initial question: how many of the U.S. poor work? A simple answer is that most of the poor in the U.S. do not work. This question is less straightforward, however, when we note that most of those non-working poor are children. Perhaps instead we want to ask about adults only, or non-elderly, non-retired adults. Among poor adults between the ages of 18 and 64, just over 40% worked in the previous year, and about 19% worked all year, 50 weeks or more. Among the 59% of poor adults who did not work at all, we can ask why they didn't work. About half of this group reported that they had a disability that limited their ability to work, or that they were enrolled in school. This figure shows time trends in this distribution of why poor adults do not work. Since 1990, there is a decline in the fraction of poor adults who report not working because they are engaged in home production, generally involving parents caring for children. This is consistent with the increase in rates of employment among single parents that we saw when we looked at changes after welfare reform. There is also an increase in the fraction of poor adults going to school, and an increase, beginning in 2008, in the fraction who report being unemployed. The latter increase is likely a reflection of the 2008 recession, but the fraction of poor adults who are unemployed remains substantial even by 2014. This table gives a more detailed view of how much the poor work. Here we limit the sample to poor working-age adults who are neither students nor disabled, to better focus on those adults who could immediately be expected to become part of the labor force. The labor force is defined as all of those who are either employed or unemployed and actively looking for work. The first fact to note from this table is that there has been an increase since 1990 among this group of work-eligible poor who did no work at all. In 1990, 41% of this group did not work at all, but in 2014 that number had increased to almost half, or 48%. This suggests a weakening of labor force attachment among the work-eligible poor since 1990. Much of this increase reflects a reduction in the fraction of full-time workers in this group. Those who do work in 2014 are significantly less likely than in 1990 to work 40 or more hours per week. In the other direction, among those who do work, more were working year-round, or 50 or more weeks per year. The reduction in labor market attachment echoes more general trends in the economy towards reduced labor force participation over the past several decades. The causes for this are not fully understood, though declining wages and unattractive labor market opportunities are a leading suspect. Interestingly, trends in work among the poor look different for one particular group: unmarried women with children. Among this group, the fraction working 0 weeks in the past year declined by 12 percentage points from 1990 to 2014. Recall that this is a group that is eligible by virtue of having children in their household for benefits through the EITC if they work. It is also a group, poor single parents, heavily targeted by welfare reform and work requirements. As noted in the last module, Both of these factors, the EITC and welfare reform, likely played some role in the trend toward increased work by poor single parents. This figure expands on the table to show the timing of changes in the amount of work among poor, non-disabled, work-eligible adults. For those working full-time and those working part-time, there were increases in the fraction working until approximately 2000, and then there has been an ongoing decline that accelerated with the 2008 recession. The timing here provides a further suggestion that these trends may be very sensitive to overall economic conditions. As a summary, let's return to the guiding question from the beginning of this section. How much do the poor work? We've seen that, first, most of the poor do not work, but much of that is driven by children, the disabled, and the elderly. Second, about half of non-disabled, non-student poor adults of working age do work. Third, work-eligible poor single parents with children have higher rates of work than the larger set of all work-eligible poor. Now, let's look at the relationship between work and poverty in a different way, and ask what is the poverty rate for workers? This requires that we define what we mean by workers. Because we usually define poverty, in the official measure, in terms of income over the entire year, we may also want to think about work behavior over the entire year. Thus, the most stringent definition of worker for this purpose requires individuals to work full-time and all year round. Using that definition, in 2014, only about 3% of full-time year-round workers were poor. If we include individuals who worked only part of the year or who worked part-time or both, the poverty rate among workers in 2014 was approximately 7%. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, has a standard definition they use for the working poor that considers individuals who worked at least half the year, or 27 weeks. Using this definition, BLS reports a poverty rate among the working poor in 2014 of roughly 5%. Finally, using the same definition of work, those working at least 27 weeks, but defining poverty using the supplemental poverty measure, the poverty rate based on the SPM among workers in 2014 was 7.6%. A final related way to think about employment or labor markets and poverty is to ask how changes in employment status or the extent of work affect overall poverty rates over time. We can divide the population into a number of groups based on how much they work: no work, full year, full-time work, full year but part-time work, etc. This figure uses these employment categories to show trends in the poverty rate for adults by how much they work. We can use these poverty rates and fractions in each employment status to say something about how much this employment status affects the overall rate of poverty. As we've done before, suppose we ask how overall poverty rates would be different if we held constant the distribution of individuals across different employment status groups. Here, we ask what the poverty rate would have been from 1990 through 2014 if the distribution of employment status had been fixed at its 1999 level. 1999 was close to the peak with the highest numbers of individuals in full-time, full-year employment and at the end of a long economic expansion. The results of this exercise are shown here. The solid line shows the actual evolution of poverty rates, and the dotted line shows the counterfactual poverty rate if the distribution of those employed to different degrees had stayed fixed at its 1999 level. We see that changes in employment status after the year 2000 did play a role in driving overall poverty rates. By the end of the period shown, this suggests that reductions in employment after 1999 raised the poverty rate by approximately 1.5 percentage points. Put another way, poverty rates would have been less than 13% by 2014 instead of roughly 14.5% if employment had remained at its 1999 level. In addition to focusing on the role of aggregate employment rates, or hours and weeks of work, we can also consider how the level of wages at the bottom of the distribution affects poverty. Recall from our discussion of rising inequality that wages for the bottom 20% of earners have been stagnant or falling for many decades. One way to look at the connection between the level of wages and poverty rates is to look across states within the U.S. There is substantial variation in the level of wages in different parts of the U.S., including wages near the bottom of the wage distribution that would be most relevant to poverty measures. This figure divides U.S. states into 3 groups based on the 20th percentile of their weekly wage distributions. The line for low-wage states shows poverty rates over time for those states where the 20th percentile of wages in 2014 is among the lowest third of all states. Medium and high-wage states and their poverty rates are defined similarly. The story here is clear. The level of wages in a state is related to the state poverty rate. The lowest wage states have consistently higher poverty rates than states where the lowest earners earn higher wages. This raises an interesting point that requires us to return to the supplemental poverty measure. If we use the official poverty measure to define poverty, as is done in this figure for the full set of years, we might be concerned that low wages may simply signal lower overall cost of living, and so might not affect poverty so dramatically if we instead use a measure that accounts for these differences in the cost of living. To address this concern, this analysis repeats the same state-based exercise, but using the supplemental poverty rates for the years 2011 through 2014. The results are similar. Even after accounting for the fact that low-wage states may also have lower cost of living, the lowest wage states have higher poverty rates when measured by the SPM. We've seen that both employment levels and wages play some role in how poverty rates change over time and how they differ across different areas. A final important point, however, is that it may not be possible to fully separate the role of low wages from the role of low employment or hours of work. This is because low wages and low hours or weeks of work are very highly correlated for workers in the U.S. labor market. Low-wage jobs tend to have high rates of turnover of all types, and so may be very likely to be associated with part-year employment. It's also true that part-time jobs tend to pay lower wages, and low-wage jobs are likely to be part-time. Finally, many social scientists have noted in recent years that low-wage and part-time jobs are likely to have highly variable hours. For example, some part-time workers do not know their schedules in advance or may have variation from week to week in the number of hours they're able to work. This slide shows the correlation between part-year or part-time work and low wages. On the horizontal axis, we group workers by the number of hours they worked in the previous year. For example, the indicated area focuses on individuals who worked less than half of all possible hours, just 500 to 1,000 hours in the entire year. The vertical axis measures the distribution of hourly wages among such workers, showing the 25th, 50th, and 75th percentiles for each group. For example, among those who worked 500 to 1,000 hours during the past year, half had hourly wages of $11 per hour or less, and 25% had substantially lower wages. In contrast, among those workers shown here with full-time year-round work, those working more than 2,000 hours per year, 50% have earnings of $20 per hour or more, and a quarter have earnings of more than $30 per hour. Regardless of the exact nature of the question asked, there is undoubtedly a connection between labor markets and employment and the level of poverty experienced by individuals in the U.S. A relatively small fraction of workers, particularly full-time full-year workers, are poor in the U.S. On the other hand, there is a substantial fraction of poor adults and individuals that live in households with them who are also workers. Both low wages and rates of employment and hours worked contribute to the phenomenon of the working poor. In subsequent modules, we'll look at other policies that are strongly related to work and poverty in the U.S., including the minimum wage and the Earned Income Tax Credit.